So no, tell me more about like what it was like for you growing up in Michigan.
Okay, so I grew up in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and it was a great little town to grow up in. And I say little, it's not really little, it's a small city. Um, and it was a kind of a beautiful cross section of white collar and blue collar because the Ford auto plants were there. And then progressives because there were two universities there. There was University of Michigan and Eastern Michigan universities. There were a lot of faculty and students. And it's frequently got the nickname Little D because it had a lot of Detroit flavor. And I loved growing up there. I got like a pretty solid like public school education. Our school was very integrated. Like pretty sure it was over 50% minority, and I think most of that was Black. So I felt like I got like a nice mix of like immigrants and Blacks and whites and rich people, but not that many rich people. I didn't really live in a rich
Just enough.
neighborhood.
Yeah,
Yeah, just a taste. So
just
I knew
enough.
what their attitudes were like and how they walked down the street, you know. um, and I got like I did not feel sheltered when I left Ypsilanti,
Yeah.
if that's an indication, but I still had a thirst to go and see the world. And that's kind of the one thing that our parents afforded us. Like we didn't have fancy cars, but every 3 years we took a vacation somewhere pretty interesting, like Europe or Greece or Mexico. And so by the time I was ready to go to college, I wanted to go to the big city. So I went to New York City from Ypsilanti.
Yeah. And so where did your first kind of lane of creativity start? Was it always in kind of the art space?
It was in haircuts,
Yo,
fashion, and punk rock
yes,
and
what's up?
prints. Yeah, it was like oh my god, I did design so many of my own haircuts, and do not try and dig those pictures up.
Yo.
Much to my mom's dismay, who would have preferred that I was like preppy or something. I had I had fun with my hair and my clothes, and I didn't know how to draw and I couldn't play an instrument. So even though I was really drawn to the creative arts, I didn't feel like I could do it myself. I didn't really understand or didn't identify with my own expression. So hair, fashion, and decorating my room was my creativity.
Mm.
And as I said, I wanted to go to the big city, and I kind of thought that I wanted to study fashion, but I didn't feel confident enough to study fashion design. And my parents were kind of like needing me to choose something more practical. So I made a compromise and chose fashion business. And
And
that's how I got to New York City. But that is not where I ended up, obviously.
so, yeah, clearly, did you not did you quickly realize like you didn't want to do that?
It really wasn't about whether I wanted to do that. It was about getting to New York City. So I did a 2-year program at FIT at 27th and 7th, right in Manhattan. And this was like late 80s, early 90s. So it was like club kids and drag queens and ravers. And it was the best. And I got good grades, but fashion wasn't my speed. So I graduated in New York, and then I left to seek my fortune elsewhere.
Yeah, because I find that like the spirit that I had, like that made me fall in love with art and design for myself personally, I just channel that into like what I like to do now. Right.
Yeah.
Like now I'm just like a punk ass rebel who's a
Yeah.
podcaster.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it.
You
Like
find
it
that for
doesn't
yourself now?
totally. I mean, I feel like creativity is the underlying like force for everything that I do, but how it manifests could be anything.
Because how did it come to be that you would fall in love with furniture design?
I didn't even know you could study furniture design in school until I decided. So here's the thing. After FIT, I didn't know what I was going to study, but I got in a car with 2 friends and we drove and drove and drove for about a month until we ran out of money in California. And that was a wild and fun chapter just to go on an extended road trip like that. But then we were broke and there were four of us living in a 1-bedroom apartment. We were all broke. We were on top of each other. We did have it pretty figured out. Like, I worked at a record store. My friend was a drug dealer. My other friend worked at a liquor store. And then my other friend worked at a pizza shop. So we had like all the friends basics. Are connected. Yes. We had the basics covered. But what we didn't have was like space. And I kept, like, in a circular way, I kept just thinking, but what if this futon also had storage? Or like, what if this bed was a Murphy bed? And I kept like redesigning the space so that it would work for us and we weren't like on top of each other. And I took an art class at a community college, and I asked the professor who was teaching the art class, because I was kind of thinking maybe I should explore this creativity thing, you know? And I asked the professor if he knew of any jewelry design programs, because I had taken jewelry design and I thought I might want to study that. And he said, yes, there's one in San Diego State. And by the way, they also have a great furniture design program. And I heard the words furniture design. That was the first time I knew you could study that in school. And it was like a light bulb went off over my head. And I made a beeline to San Diego State and started studying furniture design. And the minute I figured out that like learning how furniture is made also is like a metaphor for learning how the world works, I was hooked.
Explain that.
Well, when you start to understand that, like, you start to connect the dots between trees to lumber, lumber to furniture, furniture to people's homes, you start to see the built world for all of its parts. You start to see how those parts come together. You start to understand where those parts came from, how they got trucked into place. You start to think about who puts them there, who designed, who made the decisions that get them put there. And then all of a sudden, like, the world becomes so much more crisp in terms of its detail. But then you also start to see all of the unintentional outcomes that have happened from people not really understanding that the built world is a giant design project. And, you know, some things just kind of happen without people putting their intention into it. And that's when things go awry.
I know that right now the fashion industry is going through a moment of reckoning as far as just like, you know, environmental issues and the role that it's playing on the environment. Is the furniture community having that same moment of reckoning too, like as far as being more sustainable?
Well, we've always kind of had that. So within the furniture industry and the fashion world's like this too. There are always, you know, on one end, your makers who are like really connected to working with only sustainable, responsibly forested materials, or materials that are going to decompose in a way that are going to regenerate or be healthy for the planet. And then there's, you know, your big box people. And I can't really comment on what like Walmart and our IKEA are doing, but I can tell you that in general, everyone who's involved with making and manufacturing has a responsibility to think about what we're doing, because we're in an era of time where humans are having the most impact on the planet. And we've got to adjust the way we impact the planet, or else we're going to adjust ourselves right off the planet.
Preach. Also too, like you, I know for a lot of folks who come into the design world, they speak through their art, right? Like that's kind of how they communicate. And so they're kind of more of like behind the scenes, but you have been in front of the camera, you know, with your art. What was that adjustment like? And how did that happen for you that you were going to step into being a host, a personality?
Oh, you mean, well, the TV stuff.
Yeah, the TV or even podcasting, right? Like we can create and not have our voices even be heard, just have our work speak for ourselves.
Right. So I started, my work in graduate school was very much this sort of on the fine art spectrum of furniture design. It was more like functional sculpture, let's say. And when I graduated, I thought that I would build my art pieces, my sculptures, and maybe sell them through galleries and have an independent studio, and I'd be an artist and I'd be happy with that. But I moved to LA and I became like kind of frustrated with, it was the height of the home improvement craze, and like Trading Spaces was the most popular show on TV. And I got really frustrated that they were showing people the wrong way to build stuff. So I was like, I'm going to go get on one of those shows. And I was a finish carpenter. Like to pay the bills while I was getting my studio up and running, I had a van full of tools and I worked for a general contractor and I ran around and did finish carpentry at people's homes. And one of those clients forwarded me a casting notice for a TV show. They were looking for an on-camera host and she needed to know her stuff, like when it came to building, but acting experience, she didn't need to have any acting experience. And I was like, well, I can do that. So I thought it was going to be an LA story where I just, everybody in LA goes on an audition at some point, right?
Right, of course.
That's what I thought. So I had rhinestone safety glasses and I went down and the casting director just started asking me questions about what I knew. And I just started rattling it off. And next thing I knew, like I got cast in a DIY's flagship home improvement show, which never happens anymore, but their first order was for 39 episodes. So the minute the ink was dry on that contract, I had a full-time job for years in front of me. And that sort of changed the course of my life.
Yeah.
So
how has being in front of the camera or in front of the microphone helped you as far as like your career?
That's kind of an interesting question because the TV, I had 15 years in front of the camera doing various things from home improvement to my own furniture design show to global international design and architecture. And it was all fascinating to me because it was all about storytelling. And each production was a different way to tell stories. And I was on a learning curve, figuring out how to produce shows, like figuring out how stories came together, how they resonated. Some of them were really frustrating because I didn't have, enough creative input or creative reciprocation with the people who were making the show. And I really started to want to put my own stamp on things. But this was also, as I started designing my own TV shows and pitching them and trying to get them off the ground, ones that I had a creative ownership of, was also when the streaming wasn't here yet, but everybody was really risk averse. So it was a really weird time. And getting a TV show off the ground was a heavy lift. And I was kind of in a pigeonhole, like people were only seeing me as a female who knew how to build stuff. So they weren't seeing what I needed them to see.
Yeah.
So I actually cashed it in and I turned down a role in order to start this podcast because I was like, I need to do something that's meaningful to me and not be just a cog in somebody else's recipe right now. So to answer your question, the work in front of the camera, I think, helped me learn the value of storytelling. Yeah.
And before we get into Clever, I want to talk about what you're doing right now. And so you're now teaching at RISD. What excites you about this new chapter of your life, in Rhode Island?
Oh my gosh, I'm so thrilled to be doing this. First of all, when I came here for a graduate school, so this is the site where I really found like I got empowered, where I learned my creative agency, where I learned how to think, where I learned how to learn, where I learned critical discourse, and I learned how to take all of my ideas from zero to something. And it absolutely fundamentally changed how I look at the world. And it's the time in my life that I view as the most pivotal, and set me on a course for being a very self-charted sort of professional, right? Like the professional of my own design.
Yeah.
And so this opportunity to come back and facilitate the same kind of creative empowerment for the students here feels like such a gift. And people ask me like, well, what does it feel like? And I'm like, well, it's like the most fertile greenhouse environment. Like all of these really engaged young creative minds are here learning how to, use their energy to change the world for the better. And it's just like exploding. It's like springtime of creativity. And it is, I just love them all so much. And I'm so happy to be facilitating their growth.
Hell yeah. Yeah, we're gonna take a quick break. When we get back, we're going to your podcast, Clever. And we're back. A quick break, huh? So Amy, tell me, how did you first discover the medium of podcasting?
Well, I was driving up to San Francisco from Los Angeles and back round trip for a long distance relationship for many years. And that drive was where I fell in love with podcasts. And I listened to, it was kind of early in the podcasting, 2013, 14. And I really fell in love with the idea of audio only storytelling, because I would feel so connected to people after hearing their voices, hearing the inflection, the pacing, particularly them telling their story in their own words, or in some cases, like the really elaborate production of audio storytelling. But what was really magical to me about it too is that you weren't trapped by a video screen or a book. You could be doing something like driving or riding a bike or walking down the street or cleaning the house. And so it was this companion. And I fell in love with it. And I, at the same time, was the same time that I was frustrated with trying to, sell a TV show that embodied all of the creative energy that I was trying to get out into the world. And so I just channeled my energy into a podcast instead. And I really thought what could be an important contribution to the design world was this idea of taking a designer and bringing their backstory forward and drawing that direct connection between the human and the built world and the intention and the passion that they put into the built world. And I thought that if the regular average listener could hear the story directly from that person, then they would understand why everything in the built world matters and why our connection to those things should be more meaningful and less disposable.
Well, that's like definitely, I'm so glad you said that, because your intention like really hit the mark. Because that was the one thing that really drew me to your show, was that it's about design, but it's about also the design of people, right? Like it goes backwards.
Yeah. And I also found in my travels that all of these creatives that I interfaced with, nobody had like a plan, or maybe they had a plan, but nobody, like, they all were self-charted in terms of their careers, and they all had these really different paths. And I just thought, if I could share a spectrum of all of these different stories, it's like a representation buffet, right? So anybody who's listening who thinks they might want to attempt a creative path has all of these options to sort of look at and get inspired by in terms of how it can be done, and where you can go with it.
In your own words, like, can you give me the elevator pitch for Clever?
Yes. It's a deep dive, candid interview with an individual who's shaping the world around us. And the intention is to give a window into the humanity behind design.
And when I first started into my journey of podcasting, I didn't realize how much I would learn myself from being the host of a show. What have you learned from your experiences being the host of Clever?
Oh, I've learned so much. I learned so much from each individual, but then I also, in a sort of, armchair qualitative researcher kind of way, I see patterns that have emerged. So many of our guests talk about not knowing that design was a profession when they were kids. Like, they just didn't know you could grow up and be a designer. They didn't know what it was. They know fireman, nurse, chef. They stumbled across it in college, particularly industrial design. Some of them kind of knew a little bit about architecture, but so that's one thing that I've learned, is that design has a real PR problem, and we need to, in some way, talk about it more in elementary school, talk about it more to our kids, help them understand that like forks don't just get stamped out at the factory. Like somebody designed a fork.
Right. Yeah.
There's a connection there. Yeah.
I had the honor of interviewing someone named Lucius Respinis.
Uh-huh.
She is like industrial designer, worked under, I can't believe that. It's killing me. I can't remember who she worked under. George Nelson.
Mm-hmm.
Worked under, for a long time. She did, and when I interviewed her, it was just really fascinating understanding like, wow, like someone, I just had breakfast, but someone constructed the design of this like syrup bottle. It's like, it's so fascinating. And what do you want listeners of the show to walk away with? Is there like an underlying message that you want to convey in an episode of Clever?
I want them to walk away feeling connected to my guest. So if there's an underlying message, I don't really have an agenda. I think the natural process of just hearing somebody's story helps you to connect to them, and by virtue of that, connect to the world in a more meaningful way. So my job as a host, I think, is to create an audio situation in which the guest is comfortable sharing with me, being vulnerable with me, and really revealing themselves so that our listener can have that really, juicy human connection vibe from the listening experience.
Is there a guest that you've had on your show that has surprised you?
Yes. I mean, I'm not surprised in that, like, I expect them all to be kind of magical because I love people. So I'm just, but there are some people that, for instance, titans of business that you are really touched when they share a vulnerable side of themselves, or a unique perspective with how creativity has really influenced the way they've done their work. And then there are people like for instance, Daniel Liebeskind, who's a world-renowned architect, and he is responsible for the master plan for the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site. And in addition to that, like he's a child of post-war Poland, and his parents are Holocaust survivors, and he has this like really, really rich story. And the way that he talked about how buildings can be sites for healing still gets me choked up just thinking about it. But I mean, he talks about how the frame of the building isn't the important part. It's for the space that it's holding and the light. Yeah. And he himself was just a very joyful, ebullient man, who just was clearly so engaged in his work. So, even after being at it for so long, that I just walked away from that interview feeling like a fuller human, like a richer, fuller human.
Wow. So, you know what? We're going to get into a part of a show called Our Podcasters Picks, Amy. So this is a part of our show where we get to ask today's guest to give me their top 3 favorite podcasts that they enjoy that we should be listening to. So, Amy, take it away.
Well, I want to start with one that I just discovered. It's brand new. So the verdict is still out, but episode 1 is really, really intriguing. It's called It's Nice to Hear You by Heather Lee. And it started during quarantine. And it's sort of a matchmaking audio experiment. But what I like about it is she amassed over 100 hours of voice memos and used them to pair people together, and then asked them to have audio only exchanges. So no photos, no Googling, no nothing. And it was a kind of antidote to the swipe culture. But she got really into like the mechanics of voice and what it is about our voices that help us feel connected to each other. So that the sort of analytical science part of that, the human behavior part of it, I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
And the way she's constructed it, like a sort of art experiment, a social experiment. I think there's a lot of potential there. So I want to shout that one out.
Okay.
Another one I just started listening to is also new, but it's charming. And I told you that like in the pandemic, my main issue is loneliness because I'm in a bubble of one. So like the idea of love and long-term relationships is really beautiful. And there's a new podcast with Phil Donahue and Marlo Thomas. Do you know who these people are?
Phil like the old talk show house?
Yeah, like Phil Donahue.
Wow, like the Phil Donahue?
Yes, the Phil Donahue. So it's like listening to your parents. It's called Double Date.
Okay.
And it's like listening to your parents or your grandparents at a cocktail party, only they're talking about relationships. So Phil Donahue and Marlo Thomas, she's an actress. They've been married for like 40 years. And they have these really like charming conversations with like Sting and Trudy Styler is one, and Viola Davis and Julius Tenen about their relationships, about what makes their marriages work. But it's not like that chewy behavioral stuff like Esther Perel. It's really more like cocktail party fodder, but it's so charming that it just makes you want to fall in love. It's really, really lovely.
Oh, I'm definitely gonna check that one out.
Yeah. And what I'm finding too is like, I really like old people. They've got so much wisdom to share.
Oh man. Old people, you know what it is too? When an old person calls you, they're never gonna waste your time.
Right.
Because their time is valuable, right?
Yeah.
Like they live long enough to understand that life is just, it can go at any moment. So when they hit you up, when they call you for a project, when they want to talk to you, they're using their time very, very valuable. And they appreciate your time.
Yeah. Agreed. So this also has a little bit of that vibe. Like they get straight to the real business. It feels fully nutritional, but also very, very comfortable and friendly.
Oh, I can't wait to check this one out.
And then the third one is The Apology Line. It's a Wondery sort of in the true crime category. Have you heard of this one?
No.
Oh my God. So an artist, it's New York art in the 80s. And an artist in the 80s started an answer phone system. He put flyers up around town and invited people to apologize for their sins on this answer phone. And it was different than like a confession or apologizing to the police. So it was a way to get things off your chest. But the calls that started coming through, it's a fascinating use of like nostalgic audio from these audio tapes. There are certainly some characters that come through that are like posturing as serial killers, and then some that are probably really, really evil characters.
Yeah.
And the artist who started this whole project to begin with kind of gets wrapped up in the whole thing and twisted with one of these repeat callers who seems to be a legitimately evil doer, and then becomes sort of obsessed with him and his own like shadowy nature. And it's fascinating and really well done. And it's also a really interesting look at like New York in the 80s, but through audio.
And what's this one called again?
The Apology Line.
The Apology Line. Okay, I'm definitely gonna check that one out too. Yeah, I literally learned about new podcasts from doing the show.
I bet.
That's how I know what's going on. And so, Amy, before we get out of here, why do you podcast?
Why do I podcast?
Yep.
Because I feel really, really powerfully about holding space and sharing stories.
Amy Devis, thank you so much for being a guest on OPP. Everyone, go check out Clever on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. It's such a pleasure having you on the show. Your interviewing skills, top notch. Clever is such a top notch show. Really, really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Corey.